I'm so happy God of War is now on the PC. I started playing it on my PS4 and the performance just wasn't there to do this game justice. Wow. Now, what are we testing out here and why are we only at 58 FPS? Let's take a look. Oops, wrong menu button. So this is an RX 6800 XT, which according to the official system requirements chart, is recommended for 60 FPS at 4K Ultra settings. And we're running the game at 4K. Notice that currently FSR and render scaling are turned off, so we're at native 4K resolution, and the graphic settings here are at Ultra. And I went through the little opening cinematic where he chops down the tree, and I was over 60 FPS that entire time. But as soon as he picked up the tree, notice that we're sitting at 58 FPS. Now, I think that's absolutely fine, especially if you're on a variable refresh rate monitor like mine. You don't notice a difference between 58 and 60. It's basically identical. So, and the average, I'm sure, will be closer to 60. But I want us to try out a few things here. Get this image stuck in your brain or skip around in the YouTube video, because I'm about to turn on FSR to UltraQuality, because this game does have FSR support, and well, the frame rate has jumped up into the low 70s now. That is a massive performance boost, especially if you think of it in terms of percentages. We just bumped from 58 up to 72, 73. Fantastic. Image quality wise, I know you're seeing some YouTube compression on this, but for me, it looks slightly more sharpened using FSR, which doesn't necessarily mean worse. Some people even prefer a slight sharpening pass to the image. The details in the foliage and things like that, even on my 48-inch screen that I'm sitting very close to right now, still look very crisp. I think this is absolutely a reasonable way to play the game, is just max everything out, FSR UltraQuality if you want a bit of a frame rate boost. Although, to be honest, our performance was so good that I think just running the game at native could make perfect sense. However, let's also go ahead and try out the FSR down to the quality setting. Personally, I wouldn't usually go this low. Frame rate going up to 80 rather than 72. I can start to see, if you look at the tree branches around Atreus, again, on my very large 4K screen and sitting close to it, I can start to see some breakup in the detail on those branches and things like that, even some of the closer ones. So personally, I wouldn't go this aggressive on the FSR, but it's nice to have that option, especially if you're on a smaller screen, it might be less noticeable. Let's go back to that native image so you can see. Once again, it was not all in my head. When I'm looking at the little details in the foliage, I definitely feel like it does look better here at native. Okay, let's go ahead and try out the game's built-in render scaler, though, because the render scaling in this game, I believe, I listened to the Digital Foundry test video, and they did say that this is a TAA based upscaler, meaning that FidelityFX Super Resolution doesn't have access to the motion vectors in the game, whereas a TAA-based upscaler technique does. It's not like DLSS where it also then assists it using AI, but it does have the motion vectors and the temporal data. So let's try it at a 90% res scale. Notice that we don't get the increased sharpening that we get from the FSR implementation. 90% is getting us up to 64 FPS. We're now above 60. I will say, this is probably going to be hard to see in the YouTube video, but you know how the camera shakes? With this camera shake, I feel like the TAA res scaler blurs a little bit on that motion. Now, you can actually turn off the camera shake, or at least turn it down under the camera settings. I think it's the ambient camera sway. So I actually wonder if I turned that off. Yeah, to me it looks a bit sharper with that off, although actually everything almost looks a little bit worse now. Things actually kind of look a little bit checkerboarded. I almost feel like that didn't apply properly. That's interesting. I'm going to try turning that back up to 100%. Yeah, that definitely looks crisper now. That actually looks really weird with the camera sway off. Let me go back to 90% again and see if that was a bug. No, I can definitely see in the details that there's a little bit of jaggies in the image now. Okay, so I'm actually going to call it and say that I think that FSR is better than the native res scaler in this game. To my eye, it's not even a doubt. I'm going to say that going to the FSR UltraQuality, the foliage looks much more put together here, and the frame rate's better as well. Obviously, I could have decreased the render scaler further to match frame rate, but it already looked worse than this does. So I'm definitely going to recommend using FSR instead of the game's internal render scaler if you are planning on using any kind of render scaling at all. But that's not the only way to get some performance back. So how about we now play around with the actual graphics settings? I believe that the largest impact that any graphics setting has in the game is the shadows. Now, if I go to custom settings, I should be able to kick everything up to ultra, except for shadows. We're going to try shadows on high. So notice that we were getting 58 FPS. We're now jumping up all the way to 67 by just reducing shadows to high. Now, it does have a difference in the scene. I think that the distant objects, like the trees up above us, are having casting less shadows than they were before. Let's switch back to the ultra shadows in order to compare. But I think we're going to see that there's just more shadows on the ultra setting. They also look a little bit crisper to me. But given that the difference was between apparently 60 FPS now, 60 FPS and upper 60s, I feel like it might make more sense just to turn shadows down to high if you want to make sure you're above 60 rather than going to some render scaling technique like FSR. So to be honest, I feel like my personal recommended settings for 4K in this game are just going to be to turn the shadows down to high and run it at a native 4K, because now I'm well above 60 FPS and things are looking pretty good. Now, let's also just test out in general the other graphics presets. So what if we just turn everything down to the high preset? So this is getting us up to 72 FPS. So notice that it's only gaining 5 FPS more, I think it is, to turn everything down to high rather than just turn shadows down to high. So that really does seem to be the bang for the buck performance setting change. Let's also go down to original. So this is the original PS4 graphics, but running at native 4K, 82 FPS now. So this is well above what the consoles were able to deliver in terms of resolution and frame rate, which is fantastic. And going down to low settings would be silly on this GPU, but we might as well, test it out just for fun. And that gets us up to 92 FPS, but it doesn't make any sense at all, in my opinion, to actually use that setting. Although the game still does look pretty okay at these low settings. All right, the last thing that I think we should test out is some other actual display resolutions. But am I not able to do that without restarting the game? Okay, I restarted the game at 1440p. I believe we're still on all native ultra settings. Let's double check that. 1440p, no render scaling, no FSR, and we're at ultra. And in this scene, we are in the mid 80s, which I've got to say is fantastic. I think that in a game that was designed for 30 FPS gameplay on consoles, playing it at mid 80s is going to be just fine. Now, with that being said, I think it would make sense just to check out a couple of things. First of all, what if we just turn shadows down to high? I guess I've got to go to custom, and then we're going to go shadows down to high. And just making that tweak seems to have pushed us over 100 frames per second. Can that possibly be right? Did it make that big of a difference? Yeah, everything's up to ultra. No, textures are on original, but I don't think that should matter. Let's see. No, that didn't matter. Also, just a side note, I don't see a huge difference in what the textures actually look like between original and ultra. Anyway, 100 FPS, and I just to confirm this, shadows back up to ultra. We're down to 86. So once again, I think my recommended settings for this GPU at 1440p, just like they were on 4K, is probably just to turn the shadows down. However, let's also compare that to what we would get from using FSR at the Ultra Quality setting. At 1440p, I find it to be a little bit more noticeable. Also notice that it's not even as impactful as just turning shadows down to high, although theoretically you could do both. So I would say that I'd rather turn the shadows down to high than use FSR at 1440p. Although if you're looking for a much higher frame rate experience, I would actually say maybe try both. Shadows down to high, and FSR Ultra Quality does seem to be hitting 120 FPS here. So that is a huge boost over the 86 FPS that we started with. So this makes a whole heck of a lot of sense. I don't think I'm going to test out 1080p because obviously at 1440p with a couple of tweaks we're already getting fantastic performance, so 1080p should be fantastic as well. Hopefully this was interesting and useful to you guys, and I hope you have an excellent day.